Good afternoon. At least it's afternoon for me. This is part two. So this is kind of flipped it around. First one was GTI Alpine. This is Alpine GTI part two. It's a continuation and sort of new developments involving Alpine. And again, just before I start this, notwithstanding whatever I've raised, all of the deficiencies, there are still suitors apparently for GTii under the conditions of disclosure, departure, etc. So that's to be understood, notwithstanding whatever else I say, which I find interesting, by the way, and I tried to probe that very carefully. So anyway, before we start and discuss the current status of Alpine, what was Forrest Gump's email password? One, Forrest, one. Smaller babies may be delivered by storks, but heavier babies by cranes. And last but not least, or least but not last, my friend drove his beautiful, expensive car into a tree and saw how his Mercedes bends. Okay, so independent of the business side of GTii, there's a portion or a large portion, I think, of shareholders who believe and are here for a short squeeze. And part of that is because, and this is not financial advice, not legal advice, like, subscribe, share, comment. And it's partly because there was apparently a concentrated short position that was acknowledged in public documents. I think the position was 220 million shares, and it was reflective of Alpine. So people believe, or some people believe, that because of this concentrated short position, at some point in time, if and when Alpine is done, that they will have to cover, and that will cause a squeeze. And so people have been following Alpine to see if they will be forced to cover and to find out what's going on with them. So we had that going on before, and the only change, and I'm going to reference it later, is also now there's DJT, which is Trump's company, and it's managed, or the CEO is Devin Nunes, who I've reached out to, by the way, and they're seeking to undertake action to impact shorting in the United States. So it could be that the action of involving DJT, which also does reference directly MMTLP, and I'm also involved with MMTLP, but there was a letter that was attached to the submission that Nunez gave to the SEC and FINRA that included a letter that was signed by Congress or members of Congress involving MMTLP. So that is moving forward. So there's a chance, and I'm going to address that at the end also, that the action involving DJT may have the effect of either putting a lot of stress on shorts or force shorts to cover, or force companies like Alpine out of business. And a lot of people believe that if Alpine goes out of business, that will cause them to cover and there'll be some squeeze. Not financial advice. I certainly hope that happens. But I also believe that it may not require Alpine to go out of business. There may be other events that happen prior to Alpine getting expelled, for example, that would put them out. And, perhaps DJT, as I mentioned, perhaps they run out of money. Perhaps there's no more financial gain. So I'm not so sure that it requires Alpine to be fully out of business. But to this point in time, they've acted like they're defending Alpine. Whoever is paying legal fees is defending Alpine. So now to give a brief background about Alpine and why they should be out of here, notwithstanding our interest, they're the absolute scumbags for 40 years. They've been fined, admitted to misconduct, convicted of various violations, misappropriated money, violated the Bank Secrecy Act, so they may have subjected us to terrorist threats, overcharged, hired an admitted sex offender, and for whatever reason, over that 40-year period, the SEC and FINRA have yet to lock them out. They could have done so, by the way, through the court system. If they would have gone to federal court, I feel comfortable that they could have gotten or obtained control over the entity. But I believe also that they didn't do that because the SEC and FINRA are trying to protect their own territory. And there is some cases going forward in the Supreme Court right now that might impact their power and jurisdiction. We'll see how that plays out. But we have kind of competing events happening. First, we have the expulsion proceedings in DC that are happening with FINRA. So FINRA is trying to expel, finally, Alpine, and they're doing it in DC. So they started the expulsion proceedings, and this was called to be an expedited expulsion because they were on triple secret probation and they violated the terms of that by overcharging people, etc. I'm being facetious a little bit. But they violated a prior order. FINRA then decided, okay, after waiting too long, they decided, okay, let's try to expel them in a quick path. They tried to block it. That's what these appellate proceedings are. So they've been going on in DC. And the last brief that was filed was March 29th. You would expect a ruling on the appeal brought by Alpine to be decided sometime this month of May, at latest in June. And they're trying to block by the appeal the expulsion proceeding that would occur before FINRA. If they lose the expulsion proceedings, if they lose the appeal of that expulsion proceedings, then they will go forward in DC. And then FINRA will conduct hearings or conclude the hearings. They'll issue a result. My guess is they'll probably expel Alpine at that point in time. That might be an event in and of itself that triggers some stock movement. But there will be appeals to FINRA, from FINRA to the SEC, one, and probably to the Court of Appeal. So if in fact it requires to get to the end, those, you can figure, and within the SEC, if they do it quickly, the appeal should be less than 6 months. And then in the federal court, you would expect probably a year plus or minus. That would be going to the end. So now we're looking at 1 to 2 years, but we're getting much closer to the end. And again, it's my belief that it doesn't necessarily take the end to end Alpine, but that's the DC proceeding. That's where it's going. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, and that's kind of what we found out about yesterday, is there's a Utah action. And so the DTC and the NSCC, both self-regulatory organizations, are trying to preclude Alpine from being able to use their clearing services. So that if Alpine can't use their clearing services, that basically means they're out of business. What happened there in Utah is similar to in DC. The DTC and NSCC tried to get rid of Alpine. Alpine filed a lawsuit, tried to block the action. This time, instead of the appellate of that action having any benefit, the court rejected it. It permitted, and this happened March of 2024, instead of the court blocking it, the NSCC, DTCC were able to go forward with their proceedings to discipline and expel, basically, Alpine. Apparently, on or about April 25th of this year, they issued an order basically excluding Alpine. So Alpine would be without clearing services. At or about the same time, I think April 25th, Alpine filed a request to stay that action. So they're asking the panel who made that decision to not enforce it until they go through their appeals. And on the 30th, I think April 30th, they asked for the ability to waste a bunch of paper and words and file a longer brief. That apparently was granted, and briefs will be filed on the stay request. So the request that Alpine is making in Utah to stay the outcome of their expulsion from the DTCC. How many C's was that? It was enough C's. So that request for stay will be heard by, first, the panel that made the decision, and second, they'll probably take it to the SEC, and then they could take it to court. So at some point in time, I would expect to expedite things, that either the panel or the SEC will okay the stay so that things can move forward. If things move forward, the next thing would be an appeal, like I said, and then a possible appeal to the Court of Appeals, same kind of timeline. But at any point, even if their request for a stay is denied, that event could be significant enough to impact the stock. And just to kind of give you an idea of why the DTC and NSCC are taking the action they are to expel Alpine, which was effective April 25th, but is not currently in play because of the ongoing briefing. What happened was Alpine was deemed a risk in the clearing system, because the clearing system is going to be responsible for all the negatives too. So Alpine was deemed a risk, along with 150 other companies, and they weren't alone. So they were obligated to post $10 million as collateral. They didn't have it, didn't have access to it, perhaps misrepresented they had it. And as a result, DTCC lost comfort because it was a security risk in the first place and sought their expulsion. That's kind of how we got to that point. Now, what's interesting is, remember I mentioned there's 150 companies. The only one that had a problem posting that 10 million was Alpine, just to give you an idea. So after the briefs are filed, there'll be a determination. Again, I think a stay will be granted. I think then there will be a review, a fast review by SEC, and then it'll go up to the court. However, in the interim and pushing on this, DJT, that's the Trump stock, will be moving forward to put pressure on shorts. That's their stated agenda. So I think, alternatively, while all this is going on and pressing Alpine to a conclusion, because we're getting there, they're losing every fight. It's just a matter of time running out, and we're getting through the proceedings. So we're getting through all their options. But the DJT matter may put additional pressure on them in a faster time frame. So I support that movement for our benefit. I think, again, if they're successful in holding hearings and of establishing and showing there is counterfeit shares in the system, a lack of settlement, etc., it inures to our benefit too here at GTii, notwithstanding whatever problems there are with management, etc. It's just that short position. And again, part of the reason why GTii still has suitors is because of that concentrated short position. So we're still getting closer to the end. Obviously, we know the end result. The end result is Alpine's done. And I believe, because of regulatory pressure, because they may run out of money, because there's going to be no financial benefit, I think it's likely that the circumstances giving rise to what would cause a squeeze will exist before Alpine is officially dead. And talking about, can a company actually be dead? We talked about in the first video that Borger's accounting company completely shut their doors. SEC went after them, imposed a large enough fine, and shut them down. So I expect that to happen with Alpine too. It's just a matter of when, but especially with DJT and that pressure, I think we are a lot closer to the end than if we were without them. So that's the way I see it. So kind of to summarize, Alpine lost. They're expelled from the DTCC. There's a couple of additional reviews that will occur, but they're expelled in the Utah proceeding. In the DC proceeding, it hasn't it hasn't reached the expulsion level yet because the appeal hasn't been decided, but the appeal will be decided shortly. And I think it's likely that Alpine's going to lose that appeal, and it's likely they will thereafter get expelled. And since the briefing of that DC case is about 30 days ago, 35 days ago, I would expect a ruling shortly. So I think in both respects, Alpine is more closely aligned with being dead than they were before, and they've been expelled, and they weren't expelled prior to Friday. So we didn't know that. They had been, that's when the notice came out in relation to some other document. But that's quite a change in status. They had not been expelled before. By the DTC and NSCC. At some point in time involving FINRA, they had, but that somehow that got reversed, and that's ongoing, not because they were good guys, because there was some procedural issue. But as to the DTCC, without them, Alpine can't function, and they'd be done. And we're there. And now we have to just wait for the additional processes to weigh out, and for regulators, perhaps pushed by DJT, to exact their end. So I hope that's clear. And that's what came out yesterday about the ruling involving where they were asking for an extension in terms of filing the brief. That related to their request for the stay after their expulsion by DTCC. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, I'm sorry. And ask any questions, and I'll try to clarify everything else. So, it's interesting, completely opposite to the business and management side, and completely independent, I believe. So one is one way and one is the other way. Anyway, be well, take care. Talk to you later.